Mike Brown, it is always good to see you, dude. But I'm glad that we carved out some time to talk shop here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm super excited.
For sure. So we met many moons ago. I don't exactly know where. I'm gonna say Baby Bathwater, maybe. Does that sound about right?
I think that's the first time, yeah. But obviously, our paths have crossed quite a few times since then. So very cool.
Indeed, and we have a lot of, I think, overlapping guiding principles in life and some experiences that are overlapping. But one of the things that I think will be valuable for other people to hear is your background as it pertains to the military and intensity and how that kind of ties into business. But tell me the starting point for you. Tell me your life story real quick.
Yeah, just a quick life story. So I grew up in Midland, Texas, which becomes important later. And I knew two things from a very young age. One, that I wanted to be in the military, specifically the Navy, and two, that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. So I read Patriot Games when I was like in third grade, and Jack Ryan was my hero. Jack Ryan was the Naval Academy, so I wanted to do that. And so my whole childhood was kind of geared toward going in the military and going to the Naval Academy, and I did do that. And after the Naval Academy, I ended up flying jets for the Navy. I flew F-18s as a backseater. I did that from 2003 to 2011. And then in 2011, I was getting out. I was looking at starting a government contracting agency, which this was a time when the government was outsourcing a lot of the things, and I had a very specialized skill set when I was in the Navy. And then I was having lunch with a mentor of mine growing up back in my hometown, and I was telling him my plans, and he said, "No, I'd like you to come work for me. It's the best time in the history of the oil business to be in the oil business." And I had always promised myself I would never move back to Midland, and there I was. But this guy at the time was not a billionaire, but he was making a run at it. And when that kind of opportunity opens for you, one of the things I think is super important is just to walk through that door, even if it's not how you envision your life looking. And so I moved back to my hometown. I worked for him for a couple of years, and then I started my own oil and gas firm a couple of years later. And he was right. It was the best time in the history of the oil business to be in the oil business.
Crazy. Well, I want to dig into that, but first I need to know what a backseater is.
Oh, so Mav and Goose, I'm Goose.
And what's the difference in responsibilities when you're flying an F-18 for the backseater versus, is it then the front seater?
Yeah, the stick monkey, as we call those guys. But basically, the backseater is kind of trained up to be the mission commander. So they're running the external weapons sensors and basically communicating externally, while the pilot's job is to put the aircraft in the correct piece of sky and maneuver the aircraft in order to deploy the weapons. The backseater, or the weapons systems officer, is essentially running those weapons systems, preparing the aircraft to deploy those weapons.
Wild. Did you see any combat while you were in the Navy?
Yeah. So, I joined the Navy in 1999 at the Naval Academy, but while I was there, September 11th, 2001 happened. So I was actually in the military when that happened. And so, from that day on, I think that we always kind of knew that we would probably see combat at some point. And I was in Iraq in 07, 08, flying missions off the USS Truman. And I flew about 75 combat missions.
Oh my God. That is a tremendous amount of anything to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, and for me, and I'm not trying to be morbid or I don't want this to be taken the wrong way, but I think that combat is potentially like the highest potential human experience. And I've since thought about this a lot. And I've spent many years doing dumb things like driving race cars and jumping off cliffs on snowboards. Some of those with you. but trying to recreate these peak experiences. But there is just something I think really unique about going up against another human. You've both trained, you're both trying to go home to your families, and you're both essentially trying to kill each other. I think that is a unique experience and puts us in a state of elevated consciousness or flow state that's not really replicable in any other facet. And so it took me quite a long time to understand that. And I think that the things that we diagnose as PTSD in today's society is this really wide swath of different conditions. So I think that there is post-traumatic stress potentially for people that see really gnarly things. And I'm not trying to discount that, but there's also TBI, which we know a lot more about now. And that shows up, that's traumatic brain injury. And that shows up with a lot of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And then I think there's this kind of other category, which is essentially people get into these really high intensity flow states and elevated consciousness, and they don't know how to deal with that back in when they reintegrate into normal life. And so I think that part of that PTSD subset is actually people that just don't know how to live a normal life after experiencing these elevated states.
I really like that adjustment in frame. For me, this is a selfish question, as most of mine are, but for me, I've spent a fair amount of time. I've spent some time doing endurance stuff, as I know you have.
Same.
So you have. Tell me a little bit about your endurance life before we get into business, because I want to talk about the overlap between those two sort of flow states or mentalities.
Yeah. So that really came after combat. So it's endurance sports is actually one of the things that. Again, this is all in retrospect. I didn't know this at the time, but in retrospect, I was using the elevated flow states from endurance sports and those endorphins to try and fill that hole that perhaps I was missing from combat. So I got back from Iraq in 2008 and moved to San Diego. I was an instructor at a schoolhouse there, and I got way into CrossFit and then subsequently way into triathlons. And my brother was a professional triathlete at the time. So my family's always been very competitive. So I figured, well, if he can do that, I probably can too. So became really competitive with him, started training all the time, and ended up doing a bunch of Ironmans and a whole bunch of halves and other races. And then, over the years, kind of transitioned from triathlon into purely bike racing. And by the way, crit racing is one aspect that I would say does not fill that combat void. But man, going around corners elbow to elbow with 45 other dudes at 30 miles an hour definitely produces an elevated consciousness or flow state. And then ended up kind of getting into mountain bike racing, and that's kind of where I've lived for the last few years. Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack for sure.
Also, for clarity, when you say I've done a bunch of Ironman races, I have this conversation with specifically endurance athletes, but there is a difference between doing them or racing them competitively and trying to win them. The level of intensity needed, the level of training needed, the level of commitment needed is wildly different if you want to compete and try to win versus just I want to finish it. And I think that you are in the competing camp. Is that right?
Yeah. My mom used to have a saying, why toe the line if you're not going to win? So that gives you a little insight into how I kind of came up. And so, yeah, when I was racing, or when I was doing Ironmans, I was racing, not competing. And in fact, on multiple occasions, completely blew myself up. And in one case, didn't even finish because I was pushing my body to such a place where I was completely delirious. It was in St. George, Utah, when that was still a full Ironman. I ended up laying down on like 115 degree pavement and was completely disoriented because I was pushing myself so hard there. So yeah, I mean, it is definitely a different level of commitment. I mean, at the peak I was training 20, 25 hours a week, basically year round, looking to be the best. I was actually looking to get my pro card, like my brother. And then, as I started to see a little bit of success, a few things changed, including getting out of the Navy and having a real job where, all of a sudden I needed to do things a little differently.
Well, I want to ask you about this is all kind of preamble because the crossover with this mentality and structure to business, I think, is really relevant. But what caused the collapse on that one? Was it a nutritional deficit? Was it hydration? What was the? I know this feeling of being delirious many hours into something.
Yeah. On that one, I think tough to say, other than I think heat and going too hard. I mean, I probably biked the bike portion closer to threshold than I should have. And no amount of hydration or nutrition is gonna keep you inside the lines if you push your body over a certain threshold for too long. And the day was just super challenging, super hot. And so I think those two factors, the conditions essentially just were not right for an overexertion.
All right. So I could just talk about that stuff for a long time because it's interesting to me. But for the entrepreneurs out there that are like, what the fuck are you talking about? I would never in my life do an Ironman or, exercise for 20 hours straight. How do you see, or do combat for that matter? How do you see those things? How have those shown up in your entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think both combat and endurance sports have a really real relationship to my entrepreneurial journey. And I think some of it, I think sometimes it's on the opposite end of the spectrum as well. So I can kind of talk about both. Number one, I think the foundational strategy of business, and especially when we talk about scaling, right? When you're going from 0 to 1 million or 0 to 1, you're wearing a whole bunch of hats. You're doing everything yourself. You've got to have this like scrappy, burn the boats, I'll do anything it takes mindset. But in order to reach the next level and go beyond that 7-figure mark, it really takes a different kind of discipline. It's not anything it takes, I'll do whatever. It's actually becoming protective of your time, right? And that mindset from being a founder to then someone who is scaling a business actually has to change, right? Because you need to all of a sudden start doing things that you are uniquely qualified to do and outsource everything else. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck at that level forever. And so a thing I say all the time is that rinse and repeat is the most powerful wealth building strategy out there. And in my coaching, a lot of what I do is actually keep entrepreneurs from getting distracted. Like what I tell them is that if you are trying to scale, you need to be bored to tears with whatever product you're delivering. Like it needs to become so easy and so simple that you can barely get yourself out of bed in order to face the day because it's so boring what you're doing. If that's the place you are probably stepping into some serious scale, but you need to be delivering at that level. And I tie that back to combat and triathlon or endurance sports in that, you don't get fast at triathlon by stringing together a bunch of high endurance or high intensity workouts. You get fast at triathlon by never missing a workout, day in, day out, making sure you got your nutrition dialed, make sure you've got your rest and recovery dialed, and make sure that you're just putting in the work in increments day in, day out. And by the way, I used to really try and train in this intense way. I used to attack every workout like it was the last workout I ever did. And that actually kept me from getting better because I was putting my body through way too much. And when I started to realize that, hey, no one workout is going to make a difference in how you perform on game day. It's actually just the stacking of workouts. It's the cumulative effect, right? And so if you can take that same concept and apply it to business, there's no one thing that's going to move the needle. And people are always looking for like tips and tricks and hacks and maybe this morning routine or whatever. Like that's not going to take you to the next level. It's just stacking the same thing over and over and over and rinsing and repeating your way to success and doing the boring things. And there's no magic bullet, but also that's really liberating in the fact that like no one day is the day that's going to launch you to success all of a sudden. It's just like, hey man, put your head down, do the right things, make the next right decision, and it's going to work out over time.
Yeah, I like that. And I also, I mean, for me, one of the things that I live by or try to, and that I certainly say frequently, is that I find freedom in structure. And there are lots of people that I know, entrepreneurs are notorious for this, where they've got this internal bug for variety and they buck the structure and they think, no, I'm going to do it my way. I can do it better. I can be unique. And they're flying all over the place and they feel like they're constrained when they have structure. But for me, if the plan is laid out and it's crystal clear, all I need to do is follow it. It frees up all this emotional, it's boring, and it frees up all this emotional space that I don't have to think about the core thing anymore.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I agree with that, and I completely struggle with it. So, like, I mean, and I mean, this comes true in sports and business. Like, if I don't have a race to train for, I'm not going to work out. Like, if I don't have an end goal and a plan, like, it's really difficult to work out. And so, like, I need to put something on the calendar every year, at least so that I can kind of build a plan backwards from there. And by the way, I've kind of changed my relationship with racing over the last few years, and I've dialed back the intensity, and I'm trying to learn how to be more zen and more healthy and more in equilibrium. So that's a journey for me. And the same thing I think with entrepreneurship, like with business. I think I don't really like goal setting because I don't believe that like you need to be like, I need to make $10 million of revenue. Like that's a very arbitrary thing. But like, I think having a vector, like having a distinct direction in your business and then being able to plan backwards does give you that freedom, right? It's like, hey, where am I trying to get to? Or like, is this decision contributing to the bottom line? And if it's not, I need to be outsourcing this or eliminating this ruthlessly, because I am at this point in my life a defender of my time, and anything that takes away from my time for me is the enemy. And I actually think about it that way. Like, I value my time so much. I can always get more money. I can find other resources, but I cannot get back more time. So how am I going to guard that and make that work for me to my highest good?
I love that. Okay, so I want to dig into that. Like, it's unavoidable to highlight the mindset required to execute at a high level. You can't get away from that being part of the reality, specifically when you look at high performers in any sport, right? But the same is true of any way you want to live your life, business, combat, I can only imagine. So it's a big topic, but I also want to I want to get into the entrepreneurial journey because we haven't quite gotten there yet. So you got into oil because you took the opportunity, and we've had a conversation around oil at one point. We had breakfast and you were talking about an oil opportunity, which I knew nothing about. But tell me, so did you know anything about oil when you got into it? And you worked for this guy that was on the path to $1 billion for a couple of years and then started your own thing. What was your experience with oil, and what was that initial journey like before you launched your own thing?
Yeah. So I grew up in Midland, which is kind of the oil and gas capital of Texas, if not the nation. And so my dad was a petroleum engineer. He worked for large oil and gas companies, and my dad was certainly not wealthy, but he we were squarely middle class, and so we were never worried about food being on the table. But I did see when I was growing up a tremendous amount of wealth in my town. Midland is actually the second wealthiest per capita, only after Greenwich, Connecticut, where all the hedge fund managers live. So,
wow.
And it's pointy at the top. There are a lot of billionaires there. It's a town of 100,000, but there is some serious concentrated wealth at the top few families there. And all of that came from oil and gas. So I knew that going in, but I did not know a lot about the mechanics of how oil and gas actually works. And so when I went to work for my mentor, I was actually buying. I was a acquisition specialist, so I was looking out basically a sales guy. But we were trying to acquire properties, and the U.S. is the only country in the world with private ownership of mineral rights. So everywhere else, the government owns the minerals. In the U.S., private individuals own minerals, and it's one of the tremendous sources of wealth in our country. And it's how a lot of generational wealth has been passed down, is ownership of mineral rights. And so basically, what we were doing is going to those landowners, looking to purchase their mineral rights for a lump sum, and then collect the royalties when those minerals were drilled by oil and gas companies. And then we would package those deals up and sell them off to private equity-backed funds. So I've really always considered myself an investor first and an entrepreneur second. Building teams and scaling is not really my thing. I am an investment guy. And so, I was the CEO of the company, but really I was the CIO. I was the chief investment officer. I was evaluating the deals and saying yes, no, based on the criteria and based on this ridiculous Excel, 64 tab spreadsheet that I built out. But so that's really what I view my expertise as. And then after we sold that company, I became an investor full time, and that's really, I think, my first love as opposed to entrepreneurship.
That's super interesting. So I can't remember who I was talking to the other day, but I've heard this before, and it was reiterated the other day where through each chapter of life, specifically for entrepreneurs, your skill set needs to change as you want to grow. Most people, wealth is not built in the entrepreneurial journey, but it's once you do with the money once you've made it. Most people, true wealth is built through the investment chapter of your life once you have some capital to work with on the front end. So for you to say that you're an investor first is very interesting coming into the picture. How did you orchestrate that? Did you have a partner that was running operations on the front end, building the team, doing everything? What was the initial and let me see if I got this right. I want to hear the kind of the initial journey, how you structured it, how you thought about it. But I think what you told me was that you were going around Texas, presumably, maybe elsewhere, looking for land that potentially had oil on it, and then negotiating with the people that owned the land for the quote unquote mineral rights that would allow you to drill on the land and hopefully find oil. And then you were looking at those deals, packaging them all together and getting private equity involved at that point. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yes, mostly, except for we were not doing the drilling. So basically, think of this as, to use an analogy, like buying rental houses. I own the house. Somebody else lives in the house and pays us for the right to live in that house. So, when you own the actual land, the oil and gas company comes to you and they say, "Hey, we want to drill your land. We think there's oil here. We are actually going to give you a 25% royalty on the portion that you own." So they basically split it. They'll say, "Hey, we'll drill for the oil and gas. You don't have to take any of the expense on. You don't have any expertise at doing this. In fact, you'll probably screw it up. So we'll do this on your behalf and we'll pay you a 25% royalty free and clear." That's a pretty good deal, as it turns out. So we were, basically trying to go ahead of the oil and gas companies that were drilling, buy the land prior to them coming in, and predict where they were going to go next, basically. And the way we'd like to think of it was kind of like a roulette table. And so the reason this is a win-win for the landowners and us and the oil companies is that, number one, for the most part, people's interests are tied up on one particular tract, right? And it's essentially like putting your number or putting all of your money on one number on the roulette board. Like, sure, it might pay off at 42-1, but it's a pretty low odds that that's going to hit. What we wanted to do was essentially cover all of the numbers, right? And then B, Now the oil and gas company coming to drill has a professional to negotiate with rather than an uneducated landowner. So we can actually put more advantageous contracts in place when they are coming to drill those properties. So we would go acquire these properties and then, basically package it up. So again, to use the real estate analogy, maybe now we have 100 doors. We sell that off to a private equity fund that's significantly bigger than us. So we are an aggregator. Basically, we're going out looking for deals from $50,000 to $2 million, call it. And then we would put it together in like $10 to $15 million tranches and sell it off.
Interesting. Okay. And so you were the investor mind in this, and you were presumably running the analytics on this stuff, looking for what was a good deal. What was the rest of the business? And did you have a partner in it? What was the business makeup like?
Yeah, so I would be super remiss if I didn't talk about my partner Jay. We flew jets together in the Navy, and not long after I moved back to Midland, I was working for my mentor. He was getting out as well, and he called me and asked how I was doing, and I said, "Get here as fast as you can. This is incredible." And so he came down and he got a job with the same firm, and then we left and started our company together. And at first, we were actually both trying to do both. We were both trying to go acquire the deals and evaluate the deals. And we were kind of just like two silos operating together. And then we quickly realized it would actually be more advantageous to take advantage of kind of, Adam Smith Wealth of Nations. Like, hey, I'm better at evaluating these deals and maybe and going to knock them down. You handle all the logistics on the back end of making sure the administration and the operations of the company runs correctly. And so we kind of started to divide and conquer, and that's when the business really took off. And then at the same time, we made a pretty conscious decision that we did not want to raise money or have a bunch of employees. Like, we were doing really well. There was great margins at what we were doing. And so we kept the company as lean as possible. The most we ever had was 5 people total. And we were doing mid 8 figures in revenue. I think our highest year was like 34 million in revenue during that time, with 5 people, 2 acquisition specialists, an administrative assistant, Jay, and then he and I. And we actually weren't working that hard at that point. So, it was a very lean business. It was a very profitable business. Hindsight's 2020, as it always is. There's a part of me that says, man, we could have gone to raise 100, 200, 300 million dollars like a lot of our peers did, and we could have hired 30 guys on the phones to just beat the streets. But that's not the lifestyle we wanted to live, and we were always very cognizant that like money is not our highest value. That living a good intentional life is much more important to us. And so, I certainly could have made a lot more money, but at the same time, I chose lifestyle over anything else, and I wouldn't trade it.
Says the guy that was spending 25 hours a week to compete in Ironman races and triathlons.
Yeah, and I was not doing that anymore at this time. Once that was my 25 hours a week training kind of subsided in 2011 or 2012 when we founded our company.
So, was the choice to value lifestyle over money? Do you think that was a result of spending such a significant chunk of your time being so intense with the physical training?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've never really thought about that before. I don't know. A couple years later, I think I just started this trend away from this incredible work ethic and hard work that was required by the military, because we started making money pretty quickly and pretty easily because of the hot nature of this niche at the time. And I think it started this shift in me that was basically like, well, wait a minute. Yeah, maybe I am doing something wrong here. Like, maybe everything doesn't have to be a grind. Maybe I don't have to pound myself into dirt just to get the result I wanted. Because we have this love affair with hard work in America. And we teach kids from day one, like, hey, work hard and you'll be successful. And well-meaning coaches and parents and teachers are pounding into their kids, like, you've got to work hard. Nothing is worth achieving if you don't work hard doing it. And ultimately that's just wrong. Like hard work can be a factor in success, but is actually not typically the leading factor in success. Because if it were, there are 7 billion people on this planet that work super hard that aren't, traditionally successful, in kind of what we would consider our definition of successful. So if hard work were the number one factor in success, there'd be a lot more wealthy people out there. So there must be something else, right? There must be these other factors, including like luck. Risk is a huge one that people just, I think, constantly underplay when they look at success. Like, you have to take massive risk. And we took massive risk. We would double down and never take money out of the company and just keep pouring it back in. And we called it buying call options on ourselves. So yeah, we might not have been working super hard, but our money was working super hard. And we had a lot of risk on the table at any given time. And we didn't start to clear out some of that risk until many years later. And so, that's something I think when my son asks me, or when we talk about money, I'd be sure to tell him like, hey, we have this amazing house, and hey, I know that a lot of your friends at school don't get dropped off in a McLaren. Do you know why I have that? It's because, yes, I worked hard in school, but also it's because I took risks and I was willing to do things other people weren't. Right. And so that's a factor I think that we miss out on. So I don't know. That was a whole tangent. I get fired up about hard work, but to answer your question, I think one of the reasons I've changed my relationship with work and with endurance sports is, I'm going to call this 2016 now. I wake up and I've done all of the things that I'm supposed to do. Right. I've been in combat. I've been in the Navy. I've achieved in high levels at various sports. I've done all of this external stuff that was supposed to make me happy, and I've still got a giant hole in my soul. So what's going on, right? Mm-hmm. Winning triathlons wasn't making me happy. Winning at business wasn't making me happy. None of these external achievements were doing the thing that they were supposed to do. So now I had to find out, okay, what does it all actually mean? And why am I so driven for this external success? And what does it look like to turn internal and find out how to be happy on the inside?
Do you think you would have been able to get to that point had you not pushed the limit of the hard work?
No. And I think I've talked about my childhood a couple times, by the way. By all means, I love to say it's not the trauma Olympics. Like, everyone likes to compare their childhood with everyone else and be like, oh, my childhood was fine. My childhood was really great. And in some ways, because my mom pushed us really hard, like, I inherited some traits that I didn't necessarily choose, which is like, that if you're not going to win, don't toe the line. Like, Browns win at all costs. Like, learning some of these behaviors, like, that was just kind of ingrained in me that, like, we work hard and we win. By the way, that's great patterns to inherit from your parents, if you want to be successful. So all of that is exactly what made me successful. But our traumas eventually become limitations, right? So the very patterns that made us successful, at some point, if we continue to grow, we're going to bump up on those as limitations. And I think that's exactly what happens, right? Is like, once I got to that place, all of those external accolades were not making me happy. And so I had to kind of go through that what does it all mean thing and understand what does, a deeper level of self-love. Like, what if I don't achieve anything else ever again? Like, do I still have worthiness? I had to ask some of those questions, because up until that point, probably 35, 36 years old, everything was based on external validation.
Yeah. My persistent struggle with this is the question of, is it possible to maintain the same level of accountability and drive if success, or if being number one, if competing isn't the highest value? Is it possible to still get there if it isn't the highest value?
People ask me this all the time. What if I lose my edge? And my answer is, you probably will if your edge is trauma driven. And so when we talk about, the first mountain versus the second mountain, there's a great book called The Second Mountain. But the first mountain is building your first business, like reaching that first major milestone of success. For most entrepreneurs, I don't want to blanket label everybody, but for most people, that is trauma-driven in some sense, like seeking external validation, seeking acceptance. And by the way, these are all very normal human traits that we see. It's not like these are necessarily bad things, but they're good things to be aware of. And so, typically we are looking to prove something, prove ourselves to our parents, prove ourselves to our loved ones, prove ourselves to ourselves. Like there is some level of seeking that happens in that first mountain. I think you will necessarily, if you dig into that and realize that external validation isn't going to give you happiness, you're going to lose your edge. You're going to lose that drive to be number one if it's driven by that trauma. So the way that we essentially go through that and then regain that drive is through aligning with our actual value. And so building a second business or a looking to achieve a different milestone, you have to be in alignment with who you truly are. And then I think you can find that same level of dedication, but it's going to feel a lot easier. It's not going to feel like hard work. It's going to feel like, hey, I have the discipline to do the things I need to do because I actually care about this mission. And that's really what I'm experiencing now is I'm in such alignment with what I'm doing now with coaching and Unbreakable Wealth that it doesn't feel like work. Like I get excited to wake up every day and go, yeah, this is what gets me fired up to see people make massive transformation and have a better relationship with money and set themselves up for long-term success. That's so exciting to me that it doesn't feel like work at all. Whereas when I was doing all these triathlons, it was like, I'll put myself in the pain cave to be number one because that is really important to me. And I don't like myself if I'm not number one. Like there is such a different mindset shift, but I'm not sure the work ethic is that different. It just feels different.
Fascinating. And this is I think about this stuff a lot. Okay. So your education in oil through the mentor, then you start the company with your good friend,
partner
that you
Jay.
Spent time, in the military with. So your partner Jay. How long do you own that company, and what's the trajectory of it? You said you did very well very quickly, but what does that mean?
Yeah. So we started the company in May of 2013 officially, and we were really sure that we were going to land our first deal the next week. And all of a sudden, fast forward to November of 2013, essentially Thanksgiving, we hadn't landed a single deal. By the way, I started the company with $40,000 in my pocket, and Jay, I think, had roughly the same amount. And all of a sudden, I had $2,000 left in my checking account. I had a brand new baby, a brand new mortgage, and we hadn't landed a single deal. And then the first deal that we got was completely life-changing. And we had been working this particular lead for a really long time. And we made $1 million on our first deal. So we went from having zero revenue to $1 million in the bank not day one, but after 6 months of working. And that after that, it was really off to the races. We completely redeployed that capital and just started growing and growing and growing, and made some really good decisions about predicting where people would be drilling in the future, and was able to buy out a lot of land out ahead of the drill bit, which was super fortunate. And our mentality was always, we wanted to take care of our investors. I didn't want to be a shit salesman. I didn't want to sell anything to our private equity partners that I wouldn't keep myself. And so we ended up keeping a lot of deals ourselves. We would split them 80-20 or 50-50. And we were building up a portfolio of just stacking stuff in the corner because I wanted to be aligned with my investors and make sure that I wasn't just, being tempted because there was high margins to be able to, sell things that weren't a good long-term deal. So we stacked up a bunch of properties over the years and built our own portfolio alongside our private equity partners. And then in 2019, the market had shifted pretty dramatically. I would call it, there was kind of a boom or a gold rush. We were hot and heavy for several years. And then the market started to mature. So a lot of the private equity funds, rather than using shops like ours, started to stand up their own shops, started to put really significant money behind, their own acquisition teams. And it started to get really tough. We basically got squeezed. I mean, we were an aggregator. We were taking advantage of an arbitrage in the market. And that arbitrage really got squeezed and the market got a lot more efficient. And that combined with seeing prices essentially 5 to 10x from the time that we started for the same amount of land. We might have bought it originally for like $1,500 an acre. Now that same land was selling for $15,000 an acre. I always like to say, hey, like, I want to take my portion out between the 20-yard lines. Like, I don't need to be in the end zone. I want to make sure that I'm not caught on the backside of a boom like that. And so the market started to feel a little frothy, and we sold all of our assets and exited the company in 2019.
Awesome. And I mean, we could drill into that model, but for that's probably an elaborate path for people that are never going to invest in oil and gas. But for the sake of the exit conversation, the way that you phrased that was you sold all your assets. Were you in a position to, was it just that you sold all the land that you had, or did you sell it as a business, or what does the dissolve of that look like for you?
No, yeah. So we actually just sold our assets. We actually still own the business and the domain, though we're not active in acquiring. We actually do have some assets still in that company. We're just not actively acquiring at this point. So yeah, I mean, you can still go to the website and it all still exists. We just sold our asset base. But yeah, I mean, the exit process is something that's pretty wild. Another layer in the journey of like, what does it all mean? Like if I am not my business, if I no longer have this thing that I've kind of given birth to and that I've nurtured along the way, if my identity is not wrapped up in that anymore, like who am I? And number two, what am I going to do with this money? Right? It's kind of what you talked about earlier is like, wealth may not be built in entrepreneurship. It might be built in what you do with it afterward. And that's really the journey that I've been on for the last few years is, hey, I've got this investor mindset. Like, now what am I going to do with this? And by the way, there's a lot of mistakes along the way that I'm happy to share. But that's kind of how I've gotten to where I am now.
I mean, okay. What do you think your biggest mistake was? What would you have done differently?
So just as we talked about early on, when you're going from 0 to 1, or you're a founder wearing all the hats, at some point you have to make a transition to a more scale-based CEO who's outsourcing time, right? So there's a mindset shift that has to occur there. The same thing has to happen, I think, with wealth. We start as an accumulator of wealth, and then we need to transition our mindset to becoming a defender of wealth. And basically, I was still investing with the same mindset that I was in like 2014 when I had nothing to lose, when it was double down, put all of our chips on the line. And by the way, swinging for the fences and hitting home runs, I was still doing that like post exit. So I'm rapidly deploying my capital into all of these alternative deals. And while I have a great track record as an investor, I actually got to a place where I all of a sudden was building this house, which had a lot of cost overruns, as houses tend to do. I acquired a distressed e-commerce company, basically out of private bankruptcy, and that was taking up a whole bunch of money. And so 2 short years after my exit, now I'm completely strapped for cash. And even though I'm a multi-millionaire on paper, like I don't feel like one, because I am essentially broke, pouring money into these 2 projects. And I have to take a step back and go like, whoa, how did I get here? And something we'd love to do in the military is talk about debrief. Like in the fighter squadron, we might prepare for a flight for 2 hours, fly the actual flight for an hour, and then spend 4 hours talking about what we did wrong or what we did right. And so, for me, that debrief process is very serious. And so looking at how I got here is essentially, I never shifted my mindset. Like I was still on this high risk, high reward train, and my relationship to money was really broken. Like I didn't value money particularly. As I told you, I value time over all else. And I had this pretty fucked up relationship with dopamine. So I was, every time that you invest in something risky, make a massive return, you need to invest more money the next time in order to get that same feeling, right? So now I've got this super broken, what I would call addicted to risk relationship with money. And, again, it still works out and I still have a lot of great investments on paper, but I actually never took the time to like learn how to take care of myself and like, hey, maybe I need to put a certain amount of my portfolio into liquid things like stocks and life insurance and all the kind of boring stuff where, I always said like, well, but if I can beat those returns through my investing prowess, like, shouldn't I do that? And the answer is not necessarily. Like, I didn't need to beat the market anymore. I spent years beating the market, which is how I was when I was accumulating wealth. Now I need to defend what I've done and overall defend my time.
How do you think about that in terms of asset allocation? So you basically, what I heard, and maybe this is not how you internalized it or what you meant, but what I heard was basically you had a bucket and 100% was high risk, high reward. And then you use the language of be a defender, which might be a mentality that could be 100% defender, or it could be, I'm gonna use part of my money in a high risk proposition, part of it in a low risk, low return proposition. But how do you look at asset allocation for investments now, post exit, with what could be stability for you?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like, so through this process, I had to A, take a hard look at how I got here, and then B, take a hard look at like how I was going to get out of it and how I was going to rebalance and restabilize. And so I basically came up with a 3-step action plan. Number one, understand my relationship to money and understand why it was so broken. So go do the deep work of like, how did I develop this high risk, high reward mindset? Where did that come from? And even ask hard questions like, what was my parents' relationship with money like? Like, why do I lack value when it comes to money? So really understanding that, because I truly believe I would have been stuck in the same patterns if I didn't take the time to understand where those patterns came from, right? So I needed to understand and heal my relationship with money. Number two, I needed to create a balanced portfolio plan, an actual wealth plan that served, my values. And what was so ironic is I was able to do that in building this massive portfolio with my oil and gas company, but I hadn't done it in my personal life. So I already had the knowledge of how to build a portfolio. I just needed to do it in my personal life. So I had to rebalance my plan. And then number three is I needed to create a peer accountability board. And I think if I look back at a lot of the biggest outsized risks that I took, if I'd have had a few trusted advisors that were looking over my shoulder, and I, by the way, I gave them a full picture of my net worth, and I go, hey, like, what do you think about this deal? They'd go, hey, why don't you invest 25K instead of 250K into this deal, right? Like, why don't you take a more outside or a more appropriately sized risk to your net worth? Like, it's fine if you want to invest in this high flying startup, but like, why are you writing such big checks? Like, I think having that accountability would have really saved me. And one of the things that happens in personal finance is because it's all in closed doors, like, we can make really bad decisions and no one knows about it, right? Like, I don't have to justify my decisions to anybody. So that allows me to all of a sudden go from 25 to 50 to 150 to 250 to maybe $500,000 and keep kind of this downward spiral. And by the way, like, again, it's not that the deals were bad that I was investing in. It's just they were completely illiquid. So the thing that I really needed to do was, okay, understand my buckets. Like, I've got a liquidity bucket, a semi-liquid bucket, and then an illiquid bucket. I was 100% in illiquid assets. So how do I rebalance that? So liquidity is, to me, anything, stocks, ETFs, crypto, like anything that you can get out in 24 hours in case of emergency, that's liquid. Semi-liquid is like real estate. Like, hey, I can sell my house. I can't sell it tomorrow, but I can sell it in the next 30 to 90 days probably. So that's semi-liquid. And then a startup, which is I give you 50K. I'm not going to see that again. Minimum 5 to 7 years. By the way, probably never, because even the best VC funds out there have like a 1 in 63 return rate on startups. And we can talk about kind of the startup investing mentality later. But how do I rebalance that is a huge question. And for me now, I am only putting things into liquid and semi-liquid places until I'm completely rebalanced.
Got it. That's helpful. And I want to echo one of those sentiments and highlight it, which is it's really easy to get caught in an echo chamber or just make terrible decisions without transparent, full accountability from others. And one of the things you said was a board of advisors to help with this that has full visibility of your whole net worth and balance sheet. And that little asterisk is so important because you can, if you present an idea to a friend, a peer, an advisor, you're functionally selling it. It's very uncommon for people to present an idea in a balanced way if they're excited about the idea. So you might say, I might say, hey, Mike, I want to bounce something off you. And then the way that I explain a deal to you is with my enthusiasm, excitement, energy, I'm propping it up. And if you don't have visibility of my net worth and my balance sheet, you might hear it and think, yeah, man, that all sounds pretty good. But if I did the exact same thing and you had full transparency of my world and what's going on, your perspective and your feedback might be different.
That's why I created Unbreakable Wealth, which I've mentioned a few times now, is basically a mastermind for entrepreneurs to get this playbook that I wish I had 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and keep them from making the same mistakes I did. So when I'm talking about this second mountain and this labor of love, like it's amazing to me to have gone through this, but now be able to share that with other people and go, hey, look, like you need a group of people to share your balance sheet with, so that they can help you make good decisions. And what I always tell the groups, the cohorts that I'm running is, our job is not to really look at people's investments. Like, we want to ask them hard questions, but really it's to say, does this fit the portfolio plan that you put forth for us, right? So it's not, is this a good deal or not? It's, does this deal fit in with your goals that you set forth earlier, right? And I think that's a better question to ask when you're talking about this peer board of advisors, is not like because ultimately, if I'm excited about a deal, I'm probably not going to listen to you anyway, right? Because I've got the expertise here. But if you go, hey, Mike, you told me you wanted to only invest into cash flowing assets, and now you're coming here saying you're going to invest in this startup, like, oh yeah, I did say I'm going to invest in 100% cash flowing assets for the next 5 years. Cool. Thank you for keeping me aligned to my goal.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's super important in lieu of a very concrete game that you're playing. So when you look at employees or salespeople or professional athletes, there's a game laid out by somebody else, right? The rules of the game are there. Sometimes there's a whole league that facilitates the game, right? And appropriate incentives. And when you're talking about your own company, your own business, or your own wealth strategy, those things aren't necessarily just in place and just there. There's something that you need to craft and structure. And this is sort of the narrative that we keep coming back to, which is if you have the structure in place, then you know what rules you're supposed to be playing by and how to follow it. And then the other step here is the accountability to have somebody call you out for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something I wish I had way earlier, right? Because, as my company started to make money in 2013, 2014, like I didn't have anybody looking over my shoulder going, hey, take a portion of everything you make and just put it into an S&P 500 ETF and let it grow over there and always have this safety net. Like I was taking money from the oil and gas deals. I was putting it into startups. I was putting it into all kinds of investing. And I've invested in everything under the sun that you can think of. I've invested in hotels, fintech startups, a medical supply company. Like, I've got all of these different investments that I've deployed capital into. And, nobody was over there saying, hey, like take your high risk, high reward over here in oil and gas. Why don't you take some of that and put it into safety? Why don't you buy some life insurance, overfunded life insurance? Why don't you buy some rental properties? Why don't you buy, some shares in the S&P or things like that? And so I think it's super important to understand our relationship to risk and liquidity and I would be a lot wealthier than I am now if I had just taken that mentality and set aside stuff for my family and my family's future.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about the structure of Unbreakable and what you're doing now. What are the bullets of it? How did you organize it? And what's give me the basics and what kind of the USP is for the people involved.
Yeah, so around the same time, so first of all, I had, I've told you I've invested in a lot of things. A lot of my time in the later years of Palmaris was spent mentoring and coaching and guiding the people that I had invested in. Then I realized that was something I really enjoyed, so I became a business coach in 2019. And one of the recurring things that kept coming up was blocks around finances. And I like to say that there are no business problems; there are only personal problems that show up in business, and that's not always true. There are some business problems, but usually it's the entrepreneur running into their own personal limitations or limiting beliefs that is actually keeping them from reaching the next level, right? And so that's what we do is we look at those in coaching, and over, I start to see these financial beliefs keeping people limited, and a lot of times. I mean, this is something it's super common is to see either people exiting or with a high cash flowing business and their business is absolutely crushing and their personal life is a complete shambles when it comes to finances, right? I mean, this is a very common entrepreneur story. I got up and told my story that I've kind of given here about my exit and subsequent cash flow problems at Baby Bathwater. And when I finished, there's a line of like 20 people going, "Oh my God, me too." But mine was so much worse, right? So there is this deep problem with entrepreneurs is that we don't shift from the accumulator to the defender mindset. So Unbreakable Wealth was just this natural evolution of my coaching going, hey, this is a real problem that isn't being talked about. Personal finance is still taboo in our society. We don't typically talk about it with people. So, how do I get my playbook that I've basically paid all this tuition for? I've spent all this blood, sweat, tears, and heartache over. Like, how do I get this out to people in a meaningful way? And so, Unbreakable Wealth was created. It's a year-long mastermind, but it starts with a retreat hosted here in Morrison at my home and at a retreat center. And it's a 2-day process. On day one, deep dive our money stories and understand our relationship to money. And then day 2, break out the tactics for, okay, here's how to properly build a portfolio. Here's how to analyze our risk buckets. And then here's how to form an investment thesis so that we ask the hard questions prior to getting into investments, and then learn how to do portfolio defense with that peer board of advisors. So that's the weekend. By the way, I love food and wine, so we have a world-class chef cooking and an amazing sommelier pouring world-class wines all weekend, interacting with other, high-performing, highly successful entrepreneurs. So your peer board of advisors is real. It's actually your peers. It's other people who are going through the same things. Some might be a little ahead of you, some might be a little behind you, but they're all thinking about the same stuff. And then from that weekend, we go into a year-long program of how do we keep each other accountable to the plans that we set forth in that initial meeting.
I love it. Well, I know that we're coming up on time, but I think that fundamentally, first of all, where can people check that out if they want to look into it more?
Yeah, unbreakablewealth.co or mbrown.co, but unbreakablewealth.co will give you all the details you need. And if you think it's a fit, click the apply button. If you think it might be a fit in the future, subscribe to the newsletter. And yeah, that's the best way to check out what I'm doing.
Love it. And I think that in general, a huge takeaway there is the idea of deliberately building accountability with full transparency with people that you respect, which functionally is the idea of a peer review board, right? Which is you have to respect them. They have to have full transparency and you have to allow them to give you accountability. And as entrepreneurs, it is so easy to be the person that knows best and lead your own world and, charge your own charge. And it's so important to be vulnerable enough to accept help from the other people. So I love the framework. I love the idea of it. And it's cool that you built it, man.
Yeah, thanks. I'm completely enjoying it, living my best life. Being able to share some hard earned lessons with other people, and hopefully having them avoid some of that pain in the future.
Dig it. Well, I am excited to come attend at some point, drink some wine, check out the new crib because it looks amazing. And I appreciate you carving out time today, man. Always good to see you.
Thanks, Brad. Always great to see you as well, my friend.